evaluates the building blocks of a fast evolving nation in the 21st century, taking a sweeping look into the current trends of economics, e-commerce, digital banking, and many other structural changes in the mindset of a pandemic. The panelists discuss repercussions of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at MICA in Ahmedabad, India. Earlier, he headed the Oro University and Ahmedabad University. Before that, he had stints at Duke and Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Purdue University, where he taught economics and strategic management. Over to you, Shailendra.
Thank you, Ashok. It's a pleasure to have our panelists with us today because you'll get three perspectives on the wealth of nations. From Mr. Mayaram, because of his extensive implementation experience of getting things done on the ground. From Abhijit Banerjee, based on his extensive academic work, including on poverty and conducting rigorous experiments on how do you create the preconditions for wealth. And of course, from Mr. Madhavan Narayanan, with his 3 decades plus of experience in journalism and in policy. So we will keep things very simple. We will ask each of them to set the stage with some opening remarks on what causes the wealth of nations. Before I do that, let me just contextualize it. Sitting here in India, the two people who come most to mind when we think of the wealth of nations, one, of course, is Kautilya's Arthashastra, right? As Amartya Sen put it, the very first book written on political economy or indeed on economics. And a lot of it is on the preconditions that need to exist for wealth to be generated. And of course, the second one is very clearly Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And his formula was very clear. He said justice, revenue, police, and arms. In fact, that was the title of some lectures that he gave before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And I'll just mention one more point before we start off, which is that there's a fascinating play that if you haven't seen it performed, it's actually being performed in various cities currently. And you can read it. It's a political thriller called Mudra Rakshasa, right, by Vishak Datta. So what is interesting is that it's the only historical document, of course, 800 years after Kautilya or Chanakya, but which presents him as a human, right? Who interacts with, is shown as a living, scheming individual. And there is a quote from the play that I'd like to read for you. This is a conversation between the head of the Guild of Goldsmiths. His name is Chandan Das. And Chanakya suspects that he's scheming against the king. So to get him out, to get him a little uncomfortable, he asks him, so how's business? And in fact, the question that he asks, he says, Katham sa vyavaharana vriddhi labha. Vriddhi, as you know, is revenue, and labha is profit. So he says, how's revenue and how's profits? And Chandan Das replies in Prakrit, that is often the case in these plays like that. He says, Akhandita me vanijja, business is going well. So it's interesting that business was, and the wealth, generation of wealth was always on top, the top priority for Chanakya, and as it was for Adam Smith as well. So with that, Mr. Mayaram, the floor is yours. Your opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much. I think basically it boils down to men and material, and I mean women and material, let me put it correctly. But I think we have increasingly realized, and I think Abhijit's work has been path-breaking in many ways, that when we look at men and material, we need to look at from the perspective of man, not from the perspective of material, which is what has been done for many, ever since capitalism rose. And I think that is reversing the gaze, how you look at wealth from the perspective of human beings. Now, I clearly see, if you look at India's perspective, because that is something I understand a little more, and I'm sure Abhijit will add a lot of global perspective to that. When we look at our population, we prided in ourselves to say that it was going to be our demographic dividend, which is going to be the driving force for our economic growth. And we believe that that is how we will be catapulted into the 21st century. I'm talking of the last century when we were looking at it in that manner. If you look at our population at present, it is, by 2047, our working age population will be 58%. And then, of course, it will stabilize and then decline. Now, the question before us is that when we look at wealth from the perspective of human beings, how are we going to deal with this population, which will be close to about 800 to 900 million people reaching 47? And I clearly discern some very disturbing trends. The first is obviously what we are now looking at, which is replacement of human skill with machine skill. And this is happening more rapidly than I think any one of us had anticipated, which is actually now moving us towards, and we have seen in the pandemic for India, for instance, jobless growth and huge profits for corporations while job destruction is taking place, and also there is a reduction in salaries. So obviously there is now a rising contradiction between the number of people we need to take towards prosperity or better living and the kind of instrument we have now in our hands to be able to do that. Drivers, we have now driverless cars. We are getting these drone pods as air taxis, which will have no pilots. You have now drone deliveries. So your gig economy, which we were thinking is going to be the one which will absorb most of the unemployed going forward, is also going to be destroyed very quickly in terms of the human element, because we are already moving towards drone deliveries in larger cities. So we are actually seeing this artificial intelligence taking over, and now more and more sophisticated work, including looking at the X-rays or deciphering X-rays and other things is being done by artificial intelligence. I mean, you don't even need human radiologists anymore, or it's going to happen very quickly. So what are we going to do with that? That is the first worry or that I see. The second worry that I see is in terms of, in the context of India, is in terms of urbanization. We have not really looked at planned urbanization. We have been talking about urban development and rural development, but there is never a very conscious effort to urbanize. At present, we are close to 35% Indians who are in urban areas, according to the World Bank figures, but which leaves 65% in the rural areas. Now, service delivery, education, health, everything is not only electricity, water supply. It's not only much more expensive when it is all over the place, but also the quality cannot be maintained. It's just not possible to do so. So how are we going to deal with the question of urbanization in a country where the population, which needs to be brought into the urban fold, is going to be close to 65% at this point of time, but at least 45% going forward by 47.
That's a very nicely stated set of problems, so to speak. Abhijit, would you like to come in and comment on an approach to a solution, perhaps? And by the way, you may want to take this.
So I took your instructions more literally, so I'm going to go back a little bit. I think I do entirely agree with you, by the way. You did a frightening job of frightening us, or a good job of frightening us, as we should be. I want to go back to the question, which is what can we say something about the source of the wealth of nation? And I'm going to loop back to where Arvind ended. So I do think that they're connected. I think the key, so I have a lifetime of resisting answering this question. I'll do that again. I have a book written where the core theme is I won't answer this question. So, but nonetheless, let me explain why. So I think the sort of the first, I think, and the biggest question is, of course, that if you look in the data, can you find things that are correlated with success? Yes. Can you find things that you believe are causal? Very rare. Why? Because essentially everything, when things are going well, everything else goes well, and when things go badly, many things go badly at the same time, and that's a problem. So that's a problem in practice and in the data as well. So it's very hard to ascribe causality. The attempts, I think, perhaps the most valiant attempt to ascribe causality is by my friend and colleague Daron Acemoglu with his various co-authors. And in the end, Daron comes back to this fact that the only thing that you can very credibly say is that the places that were empty when they were colonized have done better than the places that were not empty, because there was a potential underclass to exploit, and that created bad institutions. Now, that's probably true. You need to keep the mic a little bit. That's probably true, but it's not very encouraging. I mean, if that's what caused the original divergence, what do we do? Go back 300 years and recolonize these countries? So what's the next step once we accept that fact? So and I think there's very little else that's credible. I mean, the usual piece of evidence is that, I could tell you that, for example, countries that have, British style legal systems do better, but then if you put in something else in the same relationship, for example, the temperature, then that goes away. So it's really a completely, this whole exercise of identifying deep causes, in my view, is a fool's game. Now, what that's saying in particular is also there was a very expensive, I think $120 million was spent on what is called the Spence Commission. The Spence Commission was going to diagnose growth and tell us what the answer is. And the Spence Commission did its job well. It came to the conclusion that we don't know the answer, but we'll figure it out. which was little bit of a, you might feel a little disappointed at the end of it. But I do think they were actually, I admire the courage to have said that, having gone through all this, interviewed 4,000 people and, 6,000 pages of notes and everything. In the end, they come to the conclusion that they don't know the answer, which I entirely endorse and shows courage. But I think it shows the magnitude of the problem. So I'm going to entirely punt on this question, except for saying two things. One thing we do know two things. One is we know that North Korea doesn't grow.
Sorry, North Korea doesn't grow.
I think there are things we shouldn't do. It's a particular form of state control that India had at some point, where everything had to be approved by 16 people. Doesn't work. So we know that a certain amount of economic freedom is necessary. How much, I don't know. I certainly don't think that going to full, liberal, absent all state control is either viable or sensible or defensible. So I have no, but beyond, and the second thing we know is that no country which has a population that's largely uneducated and unhealthy has made it. Every country that made it ended up with a population that has a decent level of education and a decent quality of health. So I think those are the two things we know. And given that, I would say the one thing we should take as is that we should focus not on these grand questions, but on what can we do to make people's lives better? Can we get their health better? Can we get them a better education? I think those are good questions. Can we give them opportunities? Can we build roads so that they can get out of villages and work in cities? I think all of those kind of very practical questions have consequences for this, for the project. Beyond that, I have very little to say.
But Abhijit, if I may just draw you out on the last point that you made, right? Yeah. So you said, neti, we know a lot of things that don't work, right? And you said the one thing that we do know works is education.
No, I didn't say that. I said no country has made it. Now, okay. That's a different statement, because I'm not saying that education is necessarily causal. I'm saying if you had to pick something that does good in itself, just do it. Don't worry about what it's going to do globally. Education is a good thing to do. Providing good healthcare is a good thing to do. Making sure people are not starving is a good thing to do. Let's do the good things and not think of them as instrumental. Think of them as being values in themselves, and let's do them. And the only correlation that I find somewhat reassuring is that there's no evidence that these things will backfire. There's no evidence that the countries that did well didn't do badly on education. So I think we know that the negative evidence is solid, that if you do, there is no evidence that education is going to destroy your economy, nor is there any evidence that healthcare will destroy your economy. And take that confidence and then just do what's good for your people.
I think this is reassuring for two reasons, and I'll tee off to you, Madhavan, in just a minute. Reassuring for two reasons, because as the work of Dharampal and Tooley later on showed, that the British destroyed primary education in India, right, very significantly. And this is documented in the British sources itself, that Dharampal, famously consulted in the British Museum. And now the gross enrollment ratio, literacy, etc., is steadily going up, so much so that anybody who's under 20 is guaranteed to be literate, right? Pretty much, by and large. I know you have the evidence on that, but so that at least should be signs of hope, that it cannot hurt. The fact that we came out of this, decimation of education, and now we are slowly building it back up. So that should be a sign of hope.
I think we've done very poorly. Let me insist on this. I think if you take countries that were, I think in terms of education, if you look at the Asar, even before the pandemic, I mean, 50% of our class 5 children, class 5-8 children can't do class 2 level math. countries like Vietnam are way ahead of us. They started way behind and I think this is a structural issue. Comes unfortunately from the original steps that I think the Nehruvian government took to focus on secondary and tertiary education over primary. And I think it's structurally built into our system, a certain elite focus. And since then, I think our education has always been a challenge. And I don't think we have solved that problem yet, though I think there is interesting work going on. You're right that, I mean, the aspiration to learn is there. Everybody wants to learn. People go to school. But the rate at which these improvements are happening, I mean, if you look at the ASA score, which is basically let's say a measure of what fraction of class 5 children can do class 2 math or class 2 reading, that's flat since 2005. It essentially has not changed. We have not improved that number. The fraction of the people going to school has improved slightly, but mostly everybody was already in school by then.
Correct.
And the ASA score has not improved. So I think this question of that Mr. Mayaram very importantly raised, which is in a world where the education is becoming more and more, you have to be even more educated to be competitive with the AI. The fact that we are flat is a really bad news.
Thank you. So with that, Madhavan, your thoughts?
Just one more thing,
yes.
which is that what he said, club it with the digital divide in education, which is coming.
Yes.
And in the case of India, it's huge, which is going to lead to other kind of inequalities.
Thank you. It's great to be here at Jaipur Literature Festival, speaking in the company of two titans, both of whom I have looked at from a distance and studied. Let me get a bit philosophical and anecdotal to connect the dots between what the two have been saying. Yesterday, I drove from Delhi to Jaipur, and I found something interesting. Till we reached well into Rajasthan, the entire area was industrialized, the entire bed. And Dr. Mayaram can take credit for at least the Behror Nimrana segment, which is usually industrialized, because as a reporter for Business Standard, I have covered him as a dynamic bureaucrat who loved to attract investments. He even wanted to bring Ford Motor to Rajasthan. This is my recollection. But then I said, wow, it's great to see Japanese giants on the road, although I started missing the mustard fields that I used to love in my younger days driving from Delhi to Jaipur. Then I shuddered. I said, look, Ukraine is also heavily industrialized, but look what is happening. I want to bring Ukraine into the picture because Ukraine is rich in many ways. Industrialized, got nuclear plants, it's got sunflower oil, it's got minerals, and yet today it is on the verge of being destroyed as an economy. We need to ask ourselves why, and I have some answers, for which you spoke about Mudra Rakshas. You spoke about what is called, now popularly called singularity, which is an incredible technological revolution, which is blending the biological, the digital, and other aspects of human, the industrial economy together in a way where technological progress is going to be so much. I have got material here, but we don't have the time to read out. There is something called the Singularity Institute. Please read the blogs from there. There is going to be so much abundance, but unless we do it carefully, there will be no jobs. Okay. So there are philosophical questions of what is work, what is life, what is job, which is going to come into our lives very soon. We experienced part of that during the pandemic. Now that brings me, you spoke about Mudra Rakshas and Chanakya. Let me, this is the interesting in Hindutva times we are living in. So let me use Hindu iconography. I love the iconography of Ashtalakshmi, which is used in Hindu mythology, iconography. What are the 8 states of wealth? So there is Adi Lakshmi, there is Dhana Lakshmi, which we all know, which is what we assume is wealth, money. Then there is Dhanya Lakshmi, which is food. Then there is Dhairya Lakshmi or Veera Lakshmi, which is courage. Then there is Dharma Lakshmi, which is wisdom. Then there is Daya Lakshmi, which is compassion. Then there is Vijaya Lakshmi or Jaya Lakshmi, which is not about courage, but is about having victory. Then there is Vidya Lakshmi, which is education, which is what Dr. Banerjee spoke extensively about. So there is this wonderful philosophical deconstruction of wealth in Hindu tradition or mythology or iconography. I prefer to call it iconography. There's too much of faff around mythology and religion. We would just look at it as traditional Indic iconography. Once we establish that, we have to understand what a nation can do with what it has. Now, I found something very interesting when I looked up the Wikipedia this morning. It's a fairly good cheat sheet for people who have casual knowledge but want quick verification. Adi Lakshmi carries two things in her hand in the iconography. One is a lotus, which has nothing to do with a political party, which is a sign of this thing. The other is a white flag. Adi Lakshmi carries a white flag. White flag symbolizes many things. It's peace in wartime terminology, but it's also inner peace in yourself, because only inner peace can help you contemplate on various other Lakshmis so that you know how to exploit these wealth. Because not every country is equally endowed. Not every country is the same in the historical stage. So we need to apply our minds. Every country which has done this has succeeded. You know, you have to ask, who am I? What do I want? What do I have? And how do I get from point A to point B using the resources we have? It can be instruments of state. It can be resources like oil. Now, let me give you two examples to show why I used Ukraine as a negative example, because Ukraine is potentially destroying its own wealth by being too, fierce in nationalistic terms, in my opinion, although you can say sovereignty and all that, but discretion, as the English saying goes, is the better part of valor. So let me quote the example of Finland. Finland is a prosperous country, and right next to the Soviet Union, it always stayed clear of any Soviet trouble. So they kept away from the Russians. They said, we want peace, we will create wealth, and they have done so. Singapore has absolutely nothing. Singapore had only location. To use Conrad Hilton's famous hotel logic, the only three things that matter for a hotel are location, location, and location. So Singapore had only location. They didn't have wealth. They were also colonialized like us. They still get water from Malaysia. So what did they do? They simply turned it into a free port. They looked at the context and interpreted what they had and what they didn't, and got into a wealthy station. What did Switzerland do? They only had mountains, and apart from making cheese, they got into tourism. They got into Swiss banking. If you ask me, it is nothing but putting confidentiality in a bottle and selling it worldwide. So you have to really understand how wealth is created. For that, you need the Adi Lakshmi is contemplation and contemplating about other things. Now, let me come to something that is implied in what Dr. Banerjee has done great work on, which he chose not to speak about today, which I'm going to draw him into, which is human behavior. You know, I call him a slumdog economist, because like the slumdog millionaire, he actually lived his real life by doing work among slums on how human behavior is. My biggest grouse with policymakers is that they don't understand human behavior enough. Instruments of state married well with acceptable past cultural behavior is also very important to understand any nation. And you have to, the instruments of state, including policy and structure, have to understand the culture. People study political economy. I want to start something called cultural economy if it doesn't exist, or behavioral economics is nothing but cultural economics. Let me take just 60 seconds more, and I will tell you that when you have culture, when you have human behavior on everything from neuroscience, you crack the huge formula which you can interpret for state policy. And all I want to say is that, quote V.S. Naipaul, Argentina is such a very rich country. Literally, he naughtily in typical Naipaul said, it had 6 feet of topsoil. So it did not produce any great men because it didn't need to. So the most rich persons in India are from the most arid regions, Marwar, Chettinad, and Kutch in Gujarat. Ask yourself this question. Their human behavior has been historically shaped by the lack of water. I'm sitting in Rajasthan. So it's important to understand, connect the dots between human behavior resources, and your own inner sense of contemplation. Thank you.
I think you're giving Rajasthanis too much credit. Let's not forget that the Buddha and Mahavir came from 6 feet of topsoil.
Yeah, so did Bihar, and that's why Bihar is in trouble like Argentina.
Anyway, not always. So, but I do take your point. I'll come to you very soon. But I do take your point. You made a very interesting point about there being abundance but no jobs. And that is exactly what 100 years ago, 100 years ago, John Maynard Keynes wrote a set of essays called The Economic Consequences for Our Grandchildren, where he talked precisely about this. But of course, from the other point of view, that is, people will have so much leisure that really people will consume culture. People will consume whatever it is that they want to do once they have prosperity. So I think that question is still open. And Abhijit, you mentioned about how we need to get the Asar score up. If you would like to come in with some observations on that a little later, I'd very much like to invite you. And also, I want to park a question for you, Arvind, which is, you mentioned the demographic dividend, but we also have a huge challenge there, which is the lowest female labor force participation rate in the world, below Saudi Arabia. Now, I think that, in my mind, takes the cake. But I'd let the audience in at this point. Please draw out our speakers. So let me see a show of hands so that we can then have a set of questions lined up for our speakers. I see that you put your hand up, sir. If you would go first.
Yeah, my concern is about the corruption that we have in our economy.
Yes.
Here. Our previous Prime Minister even mentioned that that is a parallel economy. That is our Manmohan Singh. And so if we are still going on this parallel economy, how it is affecting actually our
Understood.
economy?
Very interesting. And in the context of GST, this parallel economy presumably is shrinking, but would any one of you like to address that question? What is the role of the parallel economy in wealth creation?
Actually, if you look at corruption, I'm not saying there is no corruption. I'm not even saying there's no parallel economy. And obviously, some of it is shrinking now with digitalization, not so much GST, because your use of cash is going down, which has other adverse consequences for India at this point of time, but we'll not get into that now. But the question here is not just that we have corruption. I think in United States, corruption is institutionalized. I mean, all the lobbyists that they float around are all, I mean, it's all institutionalized. Corruption hurts us most because we have a very large poor population. Right. And that's why it hurts us more. And we need to tackle it. But this can only happen, as Abhijit was saying, if we scale up education very quickly and also give meaningful jobs to people, and that which will then reduce the intervention of the government into daily lives of the people. The more and more prosperous a nation becomes, the less and less government becomes intrusive in their lives. I think that is the only way we can do it.
Madhavan wants to say something.
I want to make a quick point on this. I have this theory that the parallel economy is India's original economy. What we have done is to impose a Western style economics based on industrialization onto what was already what I call a rural transactional economy. It sounds very abstract, I know. But in terms of human behavior, it means that you have to first understand a human behavior. You know, for instance, we had hundi as an instrument before banks happened. And so some of those behavioral traits have to be mapped, and the parallel economy has to be integrated into the mainstream economy. That's what has been happening systematically since 1991. We've still got some miles to go, but I would rather put a lot of money on understanding human behavior and then mapping it. GST is a great first step.
Thank you. Let's go here. Sir.
Hi, Abhijit. 30 years of liberalization in India. How do you see it? What progress we have made, and how do you see impacting our politics right now? 30 years of liberalization, that's my question. Thank you.
And that That's a big question. I'm not going to even manage to scratch that one. But let me say one thing, which is that I think we should think about. I think 30 years. There was a period of about 4 years, and then one more burst when we liberalized. The rest of the time, we have not liberalized. Right now, we are, if anything, we are deliberalizing. We are, our tariffs on average are going up and not down. We're not liberalizing right now, and we haven't been. Mostly, there was a burst of liberalization, which I think removed an enormous number of completely gratuitous and costly regulations, and another batch when these small scale industry entries were removed. So everywhere, but I think beyond that we have done very little. I would say we could liberalize more in certain directions. Not because I'm a particular ideological devotee of liberalization, but I think in some ways we have got into this habit of strategic protection for industries that deserve no protection.
If you look at the elections that just concluded, one of the major reasons for the BJP coming back was the fact that they doubled the rations, right? From 5 kilos to 10 kilos plus 1 kilogram of oil, sarson ka tel, right? So this was a huge vote getter, which is a good thing, nothing wrong with that. But I hope it does not, as you correctly pointed out, take away the energy for liberalization, because welfare, of course, is extremely important and redistribution is critical in a country like India, especially post-COVID. But the growth engines need to be revved up again. So other questions? Ma'am, right here. I think you have a particularly enthusiastic hand.
Yes, I had to get myself noticed.
Close. Can you speak?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Banerjee, my question to you. You spoke about North Korea. Now, this is one conversation I always have with my friends living in Singapore and Hong Kong. They speak of China and how that is also a state-controlled country largely, I mean, as compared to India, and where they are today and where India is. So what really works? What is better today for citizens of India, whether it's some form of freedom of speech that we have, far superior to what Chinese have, versus the prosperity they got in lieu of that? And I'm sorry, I'll ask one more question from Mr. Narayanan.
Not only, ma'am, you cannot take advantage of your position to ask 2 questions.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know that I would put that being the trade-off. I think China did many things right, but you have to remember that China before, in 1979, China already is way ahead of India in terms of any number of things, much better human capital, much better educated population. I don't think the comparison is just that, we have too much freedom of speech, therefore we're not growing. I don't think freedom of speech is hurting us in any way. I think nor do I think that it's per se democracy. I do think that we have a number of sort of structural problems that kind of feed back on each other. So I think the fact that we didn't very early, when it was very easy, I would have thought to have improved the basic human services. We didn't do it. And at that point, and then on, we have always ongoing battle with, I think in some ways, elite demand versus popular demands. And we haven't managed to find a good balance between those. And I don't think I wouldn't blame that on democracy. I think it is also the case that the imagination has not been very effective. We haven't reimagined our economy in ways that give space to both of those demands.
Let me go at the back. The lady there in glasses, white glasses, and the red shirt.
Good afternoon, sir.
Microphone close to the mouth, please.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Sir, since we're talking about wealth of nation, I wanted to bring in the informal economy that we have.
That question has already been asked. Do you have a rider on it?
Sir, I just wanted to ask, do you have any recommendations to our policymakers? Because obviously it's a wide topic, but there is no data regarding it. It's always a slip. So do you have any policies regarding how to formalize the informal economy?
Arvind, would you like to take that question? That would be, I imagine, something that you've deliberated on quite a lot.
So we have close to 88% of our people who are in livelihoods or jobs are in the informal sector, and about 45% of the economy comprises of contribution from informal sector. So it's fairly large. One contradiction we have lived with for a very long time is that we have not recognized informal sector. They're invisible to us. So because they're invisible to us, two things have happened. One is that their productivity is much lower than what it could be if they were recognized. And recognized does not mean formalized. Recognized means that we recognize them in our town planning, we recognize them in our municipal laws, we recognize them in providing services, in providing housing, and so on. We've seen the misery of millions of migrants during pandemic because they were completely invisible, and nobody realized that so many of them will just emerge from the woodwork and start walking. So we need to recognize them and their contribution and try and find ways to formalize the recognition, not formalize the economy. That I don't think we can do. In fact, if anything, we will be moving towards greater informalization as artificial intelligence gets into
Madhavan wants to say
formal
something.
economy.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Dr. Mayaram just said. One way to do this is to bring in social enterprises and NGOs into mainstream economic thinking instead of just large corporations. And one way, for instance, I believe in what I call bottom-up monetarism. Today, Ambani will get credit from State Bank of India, but Mudra loans have just happened only recently. That's the only thing on which I've been very positive about the Modi government on the economic side, because you need to put money, and Dr. Banerjee's results amply bears it out, that you have to give money to the poorer sections. So microfinance, social enterprises, and better monitored NGOs are a great way to formalize the informal economy.
Though one has to be a little careful. I remember a conversation just 2 days ago about how land is so easy now to mortgage with all the digitization that is happening. And so there is a lot of debt, not necessarily productive debt, that has been incurred in the last couple of years simply because it's easy to do so. Ma'am, right there, with the glasses, right there in the corner.
So, yeah, my question is to Mr. Banerjee.
Closer to.
Yeah, my question is to Mr. Banerjee. So, during the times when most of the data is underreported or incorrect, the government data, official data, during such times, what are the challenges that comes in, making the economic policies? And also, even after it's implemented, how do we know that it was effective or not effective?
How do you know a policy is effective or not effective?
When the data is underreported.
I mean, how do you know? I think you go the other way. I think you choose policies that are known to be effective. To the extent that there is evidence, you work the other way. It's not ex post. Most policies are not, you can't evaluate them because they've been implemented. You have to look, that's why the evidence to policy is the right direction. You want to start with saying, this is the evidence, I'm going to evaluate the potential for this policy and then implement it. It's too late. If you give people certain rights or certain let's say certain transfers, they're going to hold on to it. So you can't take them back. So in some sense, I think one thing we need to do more is be conscious of being very prospective.
I see the gentleman in the yellow shirt was very enthusiastic. So finally, you get your chance. It may be the last question. Yeah. Go ahead.
My name is Bhaskar, Sony Mountaineer. My question is, हमारी देश की इकोनॉमी में फार्मर का बहुत बड़ा योगदान होता है, किसान का बहुत बड़ा योगदान होता है, स्पेशली महिलाओं का. लेकिन वो महिलाएं मूलभूत सुविधाओं से गांव में वंचित रहती है. उन बच्चों को एजुकेशन नहीं मिल पाता है, पानी नहीं मिल पाता है, और स्कूल के अंदर भी अच्छी स्कूल नहीं मिल पाती है. शहर में बच्चे पढ़ते हैं इंग्लिश मीडियम से, गांव में पढ़ते हैं हिंदी मीडियम से, तो उनका कैसे विकास होगा? तो सेकंड, हमारी विदेश मुद्रा है.
सब एक ही में रखें. और अभिजीत साहब ने बहुत काम किया है इस पे, तो आप, if you want to take that question.
वैसे it's not that you can. So the question is how do we improve service delivery in rural areas,
especially for women,
especially for women. But in a sense, I think that's I think it's true across the board, and I think part of the answer is we've we've actually tried and failed. So one thing people say we need universal healthcare, but in fact, we already have had a model of universal healthcare since the early 1970s. We implemented a public health subcenter within 1 kilometer and a public health center within 10 kilometers. This has been implemented. It's just nobody uses them. The party don't use them because they don't work. So I think we need to rethink what we mean by delivering to rural areas. And I think in some ways we've been too ambitious and not ambitious enough, because we created the infrastructure but didn't make sure it gets used. I think we need to go back to the drawing board. I often said that, maybe we should actually recognize the fact that most of the healthcare in villages back to a point that Dr. Mayaram made, which is delivered by people who have no qualifications to deliver healthcare. In Rajasthan, this is my work in Rajasthan, for example, and it's still true. 80% of all first visits are to people who have no medical qualifications. We need to bring them into the fold. That's an informal area. It's exactly a blind spot in the system, but these are a million plus healthcare providers who are providing healthcare. All the healthcare you get in rural India is coming from them. They're even in urban India, actually, and they are not. Nobody recognizes that they exist. So you have to start by noticing that they exist. Then you can train them. Then you can regulate them. But if you say that they don't exist, they can't exist, they're bad, therefore they shouldn't exist, therefore they can't exist, then you don't get any effective regulation. So I think we need to rethink our entire model. That's what I was saying before when I said that we have not invested in enough imagination into how to redo policy.
So I think we're just about out of time. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to conclude in a minute, and then I'm going to come back to you with 30 seconds each. Just one point that you want to leave the audience with based on what you said to each other and what they have said to us and we've said to them. There's 1 point, 30 seconds, but let me conclude before I come to you. The big questions in social science are always tough. And the causes of wealth is one of the toughest. The only thing that I know which is tougher than this is the rise and fall of civilizations. And on that, a famous German historian writing in German identified 200 causes of the fall of Rome. Now think about it, right? A social scientist's job is never easy. If you have 200 causes, physicists are very lucky. They have 1 or 2 or 3. If you have 200 to worry about, what is cause and what is effect is also not clear. And so I think Kautilya was very clear. And so was, by the way, I'd like to point something out to you, to this audience, interesting. Kautilya was written for academics. But when kings were taught or officers of state were taught political economy, they learned it from Kamandaki, who was a woman, actually. And she also has a play in which she finds herself as a political economist. I won't go into that here. So what Kautilya and Kamandaki are very clear about is that the causes of wealth, it's that exact order, right? Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. So the causes of wealth are dharma broadly conceived, as in Dri, all the foundations. Getting all the foundations right, that includes obviously education, that includes the right policies, that includes everything pretty much. And they have a very interesting point of view. So now your 30 seconds each.
Yeah, so one thing which we didn't discuss, and I'll just leave with one word, is climate. We haven't spoken of climate, which is the big elephant in the room, which is going to make a lot of difference. But my final word on this would be that now it is time for our intellectuals like Abhijit and others to begin to reimagine, redesign, and repurpose institutions, because without that, we cannot have the changes that we are looking for.
Absolutely.
I'm going to say, this is my meal ticket, so I better say it. Evidence. I think we need to be hard-headed about what we see. We romanticize so many things that are not working, and therefore we don't let go of them. We really need to be much more hard-headed. If we want to have real change, we talk about China, we talk about Singapore. One thing that is really distinctive about these countries is their commitment to saying, this didn't work, let go. I think it's really important that we let go of many things.
Excellent.
Okay, let me exactly take off from where he finished. We need to integrate psychology, human behavior, behavioral sciences, and even neuroscience into mainstream economics so that state policies are not led by hyper rationalists. We need to have a deeper empathetic understanding of human beings and then interpret all state policies in the light of that.
So I think I'll just take 30 seconds more. I think Arvind made a very important point about the design of institutions. We tend to forget that macroeconomics is great, microeconomics is great, but in between you have the layer of institutions, which in India we have let slide. And I just want to close with the thought that the greatest institution builder in the world that the world has ever seen was born right here in India, the Buddha. He created the world's first self-perpetuating corporation, which was the Buddhist Sangha, that later became the university. And he learned from the guilds, which is one of the great contributions of India to the world. We've forgotten that. And we hope that in the next decades, we'll spend a lot of time on institution building. So thank you very much indeed for a scintillating discussion.
Thank you, Shailendra. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Arvind, Abhijit, Madhavan, and Shailendra. The author, in this case, Abhijit, would be signing his book, but for a very limited period of time. And I see on my left, as if, the box office counter for Amitabh Bachchan blockbuster has, just started issuing tickets. So thank you very much, all of you.